Everyone, my name is Jonathan Jansen. I am president of the Academy of Science of South Africa, and I'm delighted that the idea of this forum for a discussion of the relationship between COVID-19 and human rights came about. This is often overlooked in a time when questions of epidemiology and vaccinology and all of that dominates the scientific discourse and preoccupies government policy. How do we bring the virus under control, and what mitigating measures work or don't work in this regard? Overlooked in that quest to deal with the medical healthcare aspects of COVID-19 is, of course, the social aspects, the economic aspects, the legal dimensions of the problem. And so drawing attention to these issues is a very, very important part of what an academy does, and what kinds of forums we create to broaden the conversation on the fate, the impact of the disease. So it's something that has also occupied my mind in other contexts. I brought together a group of social scientists and humanities scholars recently, and we put together a publication called More Eyes on COVID. And it was basically exactly that, to appreciate, first of all, the biomedical research on COVID, but also to say, what does philosophy teach us about this disease, and linguistics and sociology, anthropology, my own field, education. And what more can we learn? And so it is in that context that I find this particular forum to be very exciting and very necessary as we move forward. Now, in authoritarian societies, it seems to me, it is relatively easy to clamp down on people, to shut society, as in China. You could literally shut down a city and there would be very few consequences in terms of the response of ordinary people. But try that in the United States of America, and people lay claim to rights, constitutional rights very often, around things like whether or not I can be mandated by the government or the state to wear masks, and so on. South Africa doesn't fit either of those profiles in a very clean and tidy way. It is neither an authoritarian state, nor is it a ultra liberal society in which people's excessive claims to individual rights and individual freedoms dominate the societal response to the disease. We're sort of in between those kinds of polar opposite positions, with the potential to swerve in either direction. And this in-between status means in a young democracy still trying to define itself and trying to determine where the role of the state ends and the autonomy of individuals begin. And those have been difficult lines to confront and to cross in the COVID period, in the lockdown period. And so it didn't surprise me at all that one of the first instincts of a country that still exists in the shadow of, authoritarian rule during apartheid. It didn't surprise me that our institutions, in this case, for example, the police, took it upon themselves to literally beat people into submission, and indeed, in one case, alleged to have killed the person for not staying inside his shack, during the hard lockdown. That is a reflection of our history and this tendency, even though we are a constitutional democracy, to lean towards these authoritarian behaviors that are very much part and parcel of our institutional fabric. So the notion that with democracy in 1994, we made a clean break with authoritarian rule, we all became these wonderful, open-minded, liberal, respectful, social agents, of course, nonsense. But it is a struggle. It is a struggle. And so part of being a young democracy is making sure that we speak back to and against authoritarian rule and its manifestations, whether it is on university campuses or whether it is in township communities or whether it is in the suburban areas where the elites find themselves. Either way, being super conscious of the role of the state, but also the rights of the individual, is something that we have to carve out whenever there is a crisis, and no other crisis is large enough and serious enough to draw out those distinctions than, of course, the COVID-19 pandemic, etc. Then on the other side, of course, of authoritarianism, you have the arguments often made by educated elites, people who live in the suburbs, people with sophisticated arguments to make about you cannot force me to wear a mask. Fortunately, that's a very small part of the population. And I think that voice must be heard. And again, the position must be tested in a young democracy. When is it your right to do as you please? When is it that you can insist that the president reopens the economy regardless of what his national task team or his cabinet tells him? And of course, unfortunately, in South Africa, as I suppose in any country, those positions often get taken up by, if not led by, opposition politics. And that muddies the waters a little bit, because political stunts, by different political parties then get in the way of a scientific response, or a reasoned response, of a deliberate and a deliberated response in which you take into account evidence and arguments as opposed to simply ideology and politics and so on. So South Africa's sort of done relatively well because we're not tied in the body politic to either one of those two polar positions. We're in the middle, trying to define ourselves, not only for the pandemic, but also for the future of the country and for the kind of society we hope to become, barely not even 3 decades since the end of legal apartheid. So I think all questions should be on the table, and the way in which to resolve this, in my view, is to enable a public debate on these issues, is to call for evidence, limited as it might be in a once-in-a-lifetime pandemic, but to listen to arguments, listen to evidence, and sort of say what makes more sense. I, for example, believe that it was very important to keep our schools closed for as long as possible until we had much better evidence as to whether children, for example, which we now know is the case, are vectors for the disease, and whether they could therefore influence and affect the health of older people at home, for example, as they go back and forth from school. We did not know in the early days of the pandemic lockdown about the extent to which children could get ill and seriously ill and even die and none of those things were clear to us then. We have a better picture now, several months into the pandemic, and with the possibility of a vaccine on the horizon. The point is that those are necessary debates to have in a democracy, even when all the information is not yet available, as we try to find the right balance between the role of the government and the role of the individual and in society, and so on. And again, so far, I think we've done relatively well. Science in this respect is not a final arbiter. Science is important. Science can give you the difference, like the difference between living and dying, that's for sure. But it isn't a perfect set of arguments for policy decisions, as Professor Karim, Slim Karim, as we call him, told me a month or so ago. He said, if we made decisions based simply on health considerations, we'd shut down the country, period. But of course, there aren't only health considerations on the table. There's also livelihoods on the table, people's ability to earn money as opposed to starving from hunger in a shack. And so these are very complex kinds of the issue, for example, of mental health and loneliness, extreme loneliness, has to be factored into decisions, not only about whether to open up, but how to open up in a way that makes everybody feel heard. And so in conclusion, I absolutely welcome this forum. And I leave with a summary of the key idea I wanted to share with you is that there is no firm positions that we should take on the relationship between the state and the individual, between the government and the society, between policy mandates and rights. But we have to make that up as we go along, precisely because we are a young democracy trying to figure out how to be in a post-COVID world. Thank you very much for this incredible forum that ASSAf, the Academy of Sciences, has set up with colleagues, and I wish you well in your further deliberations.